Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. You are listening to a very special installment of the NTC podcast. This is episode 98, brought to you by Sports Business Classroom, and we are coming at you guys live from Trade Deadline Day 2024 in the NBA. So today was a big day. We had a lot of trades go down, both yesterday and today in the NBA. So what we decided to do as over at the NTC team is give you guys a breakdown of what occurred the past couple of days in regards to these trades. Give you some insights as far as the money that was moved, some of the picks that were moved, and as well as the on-court perspective for all of these different transactions. So we hope that going through a lot of these trades, especially the big name ones, that you guys will get a better sense of what's going on and how it affects all the teams that were involved in these deals. So the two names that are on with me today, guys, you're very familiar with them, Avi, Colin. They've been on a lot of their most recent pods. We've done everything from CBA-centric pods, breaking down salaries, all the way over to X's and O's, going through rookies and sophomores. So this pod is going to be a combination of the two. We're going to get into the player perspectives as well as the money that was moved, how it will influence these teams from a salary cap perspective. A lot of these teams are trying to shed money. They're trying to get under the apron, under the tax. So you're going to see a lot of those strategies implemented in some of these trades that we're going to cover here today. So Avi, Colin, thanks to you, both of you, for jumping on. Always a pleasure to chop it up with both of you. Your expertise in your respective areas are going to be really beneficial to this pod, I believe. So hope you guys have enjoyed this deadline. It's definitely been a roller coaster ride. But now that things have settled down, we can start to kind of get some perspective on what just occurred. So hope you guys are buckled up and are ready for a fun episode.
After 6 hours of chaos, I'm ready. I'm ready to go.
Absolutely. There was definitely a whirlwind, and now the dust is settling. So it's nice to finally, sit back and look at how these rosters are settling in and how these cap sheets are settling in, what these teams are actually looking to do with these trades. So happy to dive in with you guys.
Love to hear it. So just to give you guys an overview of this trade deadline, Ali Shafiq, he's a part of our NTC team. He works on a lot of our graphics. And if you guys are longtime listeners, watchers, we've done some pods with him in the past as well. But he came up with a graphic for us. You'll see this on our social media here soon if you haven't already. But there were 19 teams involved in trades between February 7th and February 8th, which is today's trade deadline. There were 45 players that were moved between all of the teams involved. There were 3 first-rounders moved. 19 second-rounders moved. So that's going to be the theme of a lot of the trades here today. A lot of second-rounders going between different teams. And then there was over $600 million exchanged between all of the different players' salaries here involved. So a lot of moves here made. There were a couple of waves made, a couple of cuts here as well that were a little bit surprising. We might get to those a little bit later. But that's just a snapshot of what happened here over the past couple of days. Just wild stuff. But now that that's out of the way, guys, let's dive into some specifics here. So like I mentioned before, we definitely want to get into the big name trades here first, the trades that are going to significantly impact these teams that were involved in these deals. These aren't players that are going to be waived and stretched. These aren't insignificant players. These are big-time rotational players that will be starters, that will be main rotation players for the teams who are involved. Let's go ahead and start with the Knicks trade here, the Knicks and Pistons trade. That was one of the first ones announced here today. So that's going to involve, from the Knicks perspective, they acquire Bogdan Bogdanovic and Alec Burks from the Pistons. And on the Pistons side, they get Quentin Grimes, who was not getting a lot of run here for the Knicks here recently. He was out of the rotation. So now he comes into the Pistons fold, and you got to believe he's going to get some real run based on what he has done in the past, specifically last year for the Knicks, along with Malachi Flynn, Evan Fournier, Ryan Arcidiacono, and 2 second-rounders. So those names for the Pistons, not the biggest names, but Quentin Grimes is the headliner. And then, of course, the Pistons are still in acquisition mode as far as just getting some picks to restock their reserves there. But the Knicks are the big winners in this deal, just looking at it from an on-court perspective, because Bogdanovic and Alec Burks are 2 very solid creators. They can go for 20-plus any given night. Both of them, I believe, have had 30-plus point games already this season. So for the Knicks, their bench has been underpowered since they traded Emmanuel Quickley to the Raptors. They bring in 2 guys that can work off the pick and roll. They can hit threes at a high clip. And they're just going to overall give a little bit more juice to the Knicks bench that has been kind of sketchy here since they lost those key contributors in the prior trade. But they also are going to need those guys to step up because it was just announced that OG Anunoby, their pickup from a recent trade, he's going to miss several weeks. Randall is already missing a lot of time here. Mitchell Robinson is out for the year. So this just gives them a little bit more depth to handle the injuries. So those are the first few impressions I get from this trade. Avi, I want to pass it over to you and just get some of your insights on this trade. How you feel like this is going to affect both sides? And, are you a fan of the Pistons moving off of these two veterans that were producing at a high level? Did they sell high on this deal?
Selling high is relative. Selling high compared to what they might have gone maybe earlier this season. I think waiting up until the trade deadline didn't really cost them in any meaningful way. If anything, I think they were able to prey off of the Knicks' desperation to be able to include Quentin Grimes in it. But when I consider what they might have been able to get for Bogdanovic if they had tried this sort of move last year, compared to that, I wouldn't call this selling high at all. I think you are still selling them on a downswing. What with the Pistons having struggled so much defensively and at times offensively this season, even compared to last year. So I wouldn't necessarily say that they were selling high, but for the Knicks, I mean, this is a really important trade. Ever since they lost Emmanuel quickly, their bench scoring had fallen off. With Randall and OG Anunoby hurt, we were reaching bench lineups where they're dependent on Precious Achua, Miles McBride, Jericho Sims, Malachi Flynn to provide key rotation minutes as they're trying to hold on for dear life in that competitive top 5 in the East. So I think adding Burks and Bogdanovic's scoring and outside shooting prowess is incredibly important for them to be able to keep pace with all the other juggernauts.
Yeah, and on top of that too, I completely agree. I think the key point here is how much you value Quentin Grimes, right? Whether you want a pick instead of a player, and obviously the Knicks. I was texting the no trade clause guys about how shocking it was after Emmanuel quickly gets traded, that seeing that Quentin Grimes' minutes actually have gone down. You'd think that he would get more playing time at that point with limited ball handlers, but he wasn't, and he just wasn't in the plans for them. So to be able to trade him, keep their first round picks, and get a guy like Bogdanovic back is huge for the Knicks. And then on the Detroit side of things, I completely agree, Avi. I think if they traded Bogdanovic last year, they probably could have gotten a first. But the question is, do they think that Grimes is worth a first if they give him enough minutes and playing time and they continue to develop him, right? So that might be their thinking there as well. And obviously, I'm assuming last offseason they didn't see it going as bad as it's going now with the new coach. And I didn't think they saw it going historically bad. I think that they saw it more of an upswing than continuing to go down. So I don't think it's a horribly bad trade for Detroit. And I think, like you guys said, and I think everyone's kind of in agreement, the Knicks killed it with the trade. They got really something that they really, really needed. It's funny because I've been posting these trade finder reports, and in my results, I had Bogdanovic as a key player that they could get who could help with ball handling and scoring. He ranks in the 91st percentile as far as turnover percentage, which would be huge for them, and 66th percentile for assist rank as well, for assist percentage. So those types of things will help give Jalen Brunson a little bit of relief for having someone else who can handle the ball a little bit more and score as well. So definitely, I think they hit it out of the park without having to give up a first round pick on top of that.
Yeah, and circling back to the picks here real quick, Colin. The 2 second rounders, I think, for the Pistons are another key get in this deal. As far as the details, I don't think we have those yet as far as what years they're going to be. The Knicks do have a lot of seconds in their arsenal. So as far as the years, it could really be anything from 24 to 30. Looking at their sheet here real quick, I mean, they have multiple seconds in pretty much every year, especially from 25 to 27. They have anywhere from 3 to 4, 5 second rounders in all those years to trade, depending on certain protections. But they have a huge cupboard here. So as far as the Pistons, they really had their pick of, do we want to pick for next year? Do we want to pick for this year? Do we want to pick for 29, 30? They could have chosen anything there, really. If they wanted protections, they wanted to be unprotected. They had their pick of the litter, essentially. So we're going to have to see how that kind of shakes out. But for them, I do like just getting the draft capital to supplement, getting some fairly decent players. And then, Fournier can still provide some decent minutes. He hasn't been playing a lot in New York, but when he does play, he can still, get buckets in a decent fashion there for the Pistons. So they're maintaining some veteran presence, some scoring there, as well as some youth, an injection of youth and potential with Grimes. So I do like the deal for both sides, but obviously the Knicks are going to get the brunt of the attention because they have injury issues and they're near the top of the East right now with their strong play. So it's going to be worth watching both these teams down the stretch.
If it counts for anything, Fred, I just looked it up. Fred Katz tweeted out that the picks that they're sending are a 2028 and a 2029 second rounder. So that seems to be the picks that they're sending out, which I consider interesting. I think it's a smart choice by the Pistons not to take one from the 2024 class, just because of how much weaker this class seems to be, and the fact that you can't use it necessarily as equity a couple years down the line if you need to make trades in certain scenarios. So I think pushing those picks further back is useful, not just because A, the Knicks might be worse than they are now. You never know. So maybe those picks will be better. And then B, they continue to hold up as assets. And if anything, they become more valuable over time as they become closer to the present.
I think that's the main goal, is that they want picks later down the road, banking on maybe the Knicks will take a downturn in those later years. And so, instead of having a pick in the 50s this year, this year or next year, they'll have a pick in the 30s in a few years from now. That's what my guess would be. If it's not assuming these aren't protected.
Of course, yeah.
Right,
we need more details.
Yeah. The Knicks are going to be competitive for, you would presume, the next several years. So they're going to need to at least push that pick out to give themselves a chance of getting a decent return on that one, based on what we've seen so far from that team. So that's the first big name trade we had go down today. We got to get to another trade that affected another team in the top half of the Western Conference here, and that's going to involve the OKC Thunder and the Charlotte Hornets. So these two teams made a trade that really kind of shook up the league, because OKC is pretty much at the top of the Western Conference right now, and they are way ahead of schedule as far as their development and how they're kind of competing against the rest of the NBA. So the details of this trade are as follows. The OKC Thunder are going to get Gordon Hayward from the Charlotte Hornets, and the Thunder are going to send back Micic, who they actually just signed this past summer. So that's kind of interesting for a guy like him, getting that deal and then being traded pretty much 6 months later. That's definitely a interesting development there. Davis Bertans is going back in this deal. Trey Mann is an interesting name to watch. He's going back as well. And then there's going to be some draft compensation going to the Hornets as well. So they also get some draft compensation, just like the Pistons did. Good young player in Trey Mann, and then some veteran presence in Micic, who is 30 years old, I believe. And then Bertans, who, at one point was one of the better stretch shooters in the league. His value has tapered off, but he can still lace the nets from long range. For me, honestly, guys, if we're looking at this from Charlotte's perspective, I really do like that Trey Mann pickup. I've gotten to watch him in Summer League a couple of years, and his ability to kind of make things happen on the ball, just being a shifty guard, getting his shots off in a variety of different scenarios, I think it's really valuable. And it's worth it for a team like Charlotte that's not going anywhere anytime soon to take a flyer on a guy like that. He's still pretty young, in his early 20s, and I see an ability for him to be a guy off the bench that can really just amplify your offense and give your team some easier looks, just for his ability to create his own shot really out of nothing sometimes. So I do like that portion of it from Charlotte's perspective. But obviously, we have to look at this from OKC, because they are in the thick of the contender race this year. And getting a guy like Hayward definitely has some risk. He's going to miss a chunk of games every single season. He's just coming back from another injury. But if he's healthy, the ball handling, the secondary ball handling, the ability to work in the post, to be a pretty decent 3-level scorer, as well as a facilitator, a guy with size, could defend a couple of positions on the wing. Very solid pickup for OKC. So I like that they're not going all in. This isn't a guy that has a contract for the next 2 or 3 years, salary that's going out. It's expiring. It's worth a flyer. See what you got. And if it pans out, he's going to be a solid playoff contributor for him. He can play some decent minutes. He can play in a variety of different lineups. Avi, you brought this up in our text back and forth earlier. The fact that he can just play in a variety of different lineups, just be a really well-rounded, balanced player for an OKC team that already has a variety of guys that are that same mold, can do almost anything in the basketball court, like J-Dub can, like SGA can. It's so valuable for that team. So I just love that pickup, and I can't wait to see how he integrates with a team that's so solid on both ends of the floor, can do pretty much anything to hang with any team in the Western Conference and really the entire NBA.
I can't fathom how far they've come. I was talking to you about this earlier. It's just crazy to me that last year at around this time, I was writing about the Oklahoma City Thunder as a plucky 10 seed that was just trying to fend off the Mavericks and get into the play-in. And now we're talking about them like, oh, they have skipped so many steps to climb all the way to being near the top of the West, and have now just stamped their foot down and said, yeah, we are ready to try to make noise this year. I think it's maybe the most influential trade this year for the actual I guess not including the Harden trade, but at the trade deadline, it's maybe the most influential trade that could determine the title, because I think Hayward slots in perfectly as another one of these forwards who's willing to screen. He's a good secondary passer. He can actually shoot, which is helpful because there are sometimes when they have configurations with Josh Giddey where now you actually do have someone to sag off of. He can take some of his minutes. And on top of that, some of the minutes that they were giving to players like Micic or Ousmane Dieng or Kenrich Williams, if you shuffle some of those over to Gordon Hayward as well, now you're just further strengthening what's already a potent lineups with a potent core of Chet and Shea and J-Dub and Isaiah Joe just bombing threes. So they are a very versatile team, a very disciplined team, and I think they can even cover for some of Hayward's weaknesses. Defensively, he's not moving the way he used to, maybe let's say 7-8 years ago, but he's still mentally sharp enough to be able to stay disciplined within a scheme. And if he's protected by players such as Lou Dort or J-Dub, he can hang out and hold his own. So I think this is wonderful for the Thunder, and I think this is a real statement trade.
Yeah. On top of that, I completely agree with everything that you said, and on top of all of that, what's going to be important is seeing the specific draft compensation that was given up. I'm guessing that it's not going to be anything too significant, but not that it really matters. What's that?
That's the best part. It was just 2 seconds, and for a team that has 34 draft picks, I mean, sure, yeah, go ahead, toss 2 seconds at this.
Yeah, exactly. And they almost have too many draft picks at this point, to be honest with you, and to get Gordon Hayward. One, as a rental to continue to have all your cap space for next year, which we can get into, as a legitimate player that seems to fit into their type of play. I mean, I just think it fits perfectly for them. I don't think it just seems like a no-brainer because it's really a win-win situation. And now when you look at these two teams and where they stand, they basically essentially have the same amount of guaranteed salary on the books for next year. They have the same amount of cap space available.
Wow.
And when you think about how many draft picks Oklahoma City has and where they stand with their roster, I mean, it's almost unfathomable what they've done
even fair.
to turn over this team. And then on top of that, they have $93 million with a projected cap of 141. And on top of that, they don't have to sign Chet and J-Dub until 25, 26. So they have 2 years before they have to worry about that. So they're in another position where they can go out and get more talent, even a max player if they wanted to, if one's available and out there. And they could do so by even trading they could trade first round picks and use their cap space to acquire. They wouldn't even have to send out any outgoing salary in the offseason. So they're in an unbelievable spot. They're right at the door in the Western Conference this year, and they're right in the pole position to even get better from a roster standpoint moving forward, which is just amazing. On the Charlotte side of things, they're doing what they can to turn over their roster too, which is what you expect. We can get into the Bulls on the other side of things, but the Bulls are this middling team that just aren't turning over their roster. That's what Charlotte had been, and it seems like now finally they're a team that's okay. It's time to unload Rozier. It's time to unload Hayward, and then we can talk about the PJ Washington trade too if we have time. And it's time to unload these guys, gather up some assets, and move forward. So I think it was the right thing to do. again, kind of similar with the Bogdanovich trade. If they traded Hayward, a year ago, would they have gotten more? Most likely. But what are you going to do? I mean, they signed these guys and they're negative. They're essentially negative assets, right? So to really get anything and unload the contract at this point and get some kind of young talent and some draft picks, why not, right? So that's where they sit.
Yeah, exactly, Colin. And I mean, it's actually kind of surprising looking at the draft capital for Charlotte. They're not flush with picks. They're not an OKC. They're not a Pelicans. They're not a Spurs. They don't have their own second in 24. They have a second in 25, but it's only top 55. And then they have seconds at 26 or 27. But I mean, if they don't convey a first in 24 or 25, they don't even have those seconds. So for them, it's like, hey, we actually need to kind of restock the cupboard a little bit. They don't have extra seconds in 29 or 30. They only have their own. So it's beneficial for them to kind of restock a little bit here, ship out these players that for them, it's not going to make them much better. I mean, they were headed towards a very poor finish anyway. What are they going to end up with? Somewhere in the mid-teens as far as wins when it's all said and done, maybe. So, if you're on track for that, why not ship out the veterans? They're only going to probably hurt your draft position, if anything. Ship them off, get the picks, get some young projects, see what you have in Nick Smith Jr. and now, Trey Mann and some of these other players. Just kind of reshuffle the cupboard a little bit and then rebuild around Ball and Mark Williams. They do have some guys to build around. And it's just funny that PJ Washington is a guy that was just re-signed over the summer. Avi and I actually did a podcast about him and Kobe White, getting new contracts. And then all of a sudden, he's on to the next team. So I think it just goes to show that these extensions, you can't look at it like as an investment in the long term. It could be, but it could also just be having a salary that you can ship out in a future deal, which was the case here. So I'm with you guys for both sides. I think it's very beneficial. They both accomplished what they're looking for. And the return, we're going to have to see how it goes. I mean, especially with picks, you don't really know the full return, the full results of the trade until years later. So that's what we're going to have to look out for. But while we're on the topic of the Hornets, we might as well look at the PJ Washington move for them, since we're already talking about it. So with PJ Washington, he's going to Dallas, which I think was a great pickup for them. And then coming back is going to be Grant Williams, Seth Curry, a 27 first rounder from Dallas that's top 2 protected. And then there's going to be 2 other second rounders that are going to the Mavericks as a part of this deal. So obviously looking at this big picture and what PJ Washington can mean to Dallas, they really needed an upgrade in this department at the 4 position. Just looking what Grant Williams was giving them, it was very subpar. I think his numbers have trailed off every single month, going from October, November, December, January. His 3-point percentage is fallen off a cliff. Yes, it's a rough patch and players can bounce back from that. But for Dallas, I mean, they were really just looking for an upgrade. I think also in the size department for them a little bit can help as well. Just, overall from a defensive perspective and looking at some of the teams they may have to face in the playoffs with some of their front lines. So I think from that perspective, grabbing him, we'll get to Gabbert here in a minute, but grabbing those 2 guys on the front line, very good get for them. And honestly, PJ has some potential to be a very impactful offensive player. If you go back and look at some of his scoring numbers, I mean, he has a game this year where he scored over 40 points. Like, this guy is not a scrub. He's not a pushover in the offensive department. He can get his own. He can make some things happen in the paint. He has great size. So for the Mavericks, playing next to Luka, playing next to Kyrie, I mean, PJ is going to have an incredible shot profile. He's going to be able to have all the space in the world. And I think that for a guy like him with his scoring potential is going to be a game changer. So I'm looking for him to be very efficient. The numbers might not be anything incredible, but he's going to be a very solid player for them. So I really like this get from their perspective. And then, looking at this from Charlotte's perspective, I mean, it is what it is. It's mainly for the picks. Grant is a solid player, Seth Curry. They're just kind of toss-ins, salary matching. They're not really going to have a huge impact for Charlotte, but it comes back to that first rounder and it comes back to the second rounders. And that first rounder from Dallas, we're gonna have to see how that plays out. I mean, it's only top 2 protected, so you'd imagine it's a pretty high chance that's going to convey. So, for them, it's just more restocking that cupboard of picks. So 2 more seconds. I mean, between these last 2 deals, you're getting 4 seconds and a first. That's not bad. It really does improve your overall outlook, going forward from here. So that's how I feel about the deal. Avi, how do you feel about it? And where do you think Charlotte stands now? Are they in better position for the future after this deal? How do you feel about it?
Their long-term books, I would say, are probably a little bit better off than they were before. In terms of future, I'm not sure what the seconds do for me. Again, it is what it is. The first is valuable, I think, so that's actually a good find for them. And Grant Williams is the same age as PJ Washington, so it's not like you traded away a younger player for someone who's remarkably older. I think this comes down to the value of Grant Williams himself. I think he actually still does possess some value, but you need to be the right team to be able to use him. On the Celtics, part of the reason he got paid in the first place was because as a low usage defensive player, he carries a lot of value. You're not asking to beat closeouts. You're not asking to do too much with the ball in his hand. You're just asking to spot up from the corners and make threes, or spot up at the wing every once in a while. Just slide along that area from the wing to the corner and just catch the ball and shoot threes. And then defensively, he's tough. He's relatively savvy. He's not the best, but he's quick and he's agile for his size. And he's just so strong and sturdy that he gives you a little bit of that PJ Tucker effect. So he's very valuable to a contender. The problem is when the Mavericks signed him in the first place, part of what the Mavericks needed were more players like PJ Washington. Someone who, okay, when Luka's getting doubled, once he scored too many points, as often happens, and the attention draws towards him and Kyrie, you need people who can take advantage of 3-on-2s, either by making passes or by putting the ball on the deck themselves and actually creating something with those advantages. Grant Williams can't do that, and it's no surprise that he's therefore struggled with the Mavericks. PJ Washington, on the other hand, he can. You can't just leave him idly to just, he'll dribble the ball and, I don't know where he'll go. No. PJ will give you 30 if you just leave him alone like that.
Yep.
So I think it's valuable for the Mavericks to be able to get PJ Washington. And then for the Hornets, again, I'm not sure where this rebuild is going. I think we need to see what the next general manager does. I need to get more of a sense of what their long-term outlook is and what their planning is around LaMelo and Mark Williams before I can confidently say that this is the start of something new, rather than just an extended foray in mediocrity and poor play.
That's fair.
Yeah, and I think the main thing with Charlotte is, what direction are they taking? Of course they're going to extend PJ Washington. That's a no-brainer, and that was a reasonable contract for a young player. Right. That's one where you're wondering why you're giving a player like him up. But, if you just don't see him on a similar timeline, that's the one player that you would think would be somewhat on a similar timeline with the rest of your players. But again, if Aaron, like you said, at this point, it's time to gather up as many draft picks as you can get. So, if they didn't really see him as a top tier player for them, moving forward with, Mark Williams and Brandon Miller and Ball, then maybe it's time to unload him, get another first round pick, see what they have with Grant Williams. Avi, you're absolutely right. He just didn't. It was interesting because at the beginning of the season, I mean, he was absolutely going off because he could hit his 3-point shots, and that's why I think that's why they wanted him in the first place, because he could defend and he could hit his 3-point shots. Once he's not hitting those 3-point shots, he really kind of falls out of the rotation, and I think that's exactly what happened. So when he gets over to the Hornets and he gets more time, either they see him now. He's signed through I believe 20. He signed an extra year, an additional year over PJ Washington, so he's signed through 26, 27. So they can see what they have with him. Like you said, he's the same age. And if they like him, they can hold on to him. He's in a reasonable contract that's never going to exceed $14.5 million. Otherwise, they can build up his value and flip him again and try to continue to gather more assets if they don't think he's on a similar timeline. So I think that's where their mindset is at. And then with PJ Washington, I just agree with Avi on that. I think Grant fell out of the rotation like we were just talking about, and PJ Washington is just a better scorer. I think the biggest issue with Dallas is going to be their 1 through 5 defense. I think that's going to be their biggest problem, and putting it all together on both ends of the floor. So we'll see it if they can. And then one thing, as far as the pick is concerned, I think that having it lightly protected 1 to 2 is interesting, but it's also interesting because, Charlotte wants it in 27 because that's, Kyrie and Luka are up at that point, and they're probably banking on, let's hope those guys move on at that point, and they're in rebuild mode. So that's a risky pick for them to give up for PJ Washington. They better really hope that they're holding on to Luka and extending him out again, because otherwise that's going to be a really valuable pick that they no longer have unless they hit 1 or 2 at that point. So
right. And guys, let's not forget, Kyrie has mentioned in the past, he doesn't want to play until he's 40. He doesn't want to play into his deep 30s. I'm not going to, go out here and say, yeah, he's going to be retired by 27, but you never know. He's done crazy things in the past. So what if he comes out here after 26, 27 and says, hey guys, it's been a good run. Me and Luka did whatever we did. We made the conference finals or whatever, but I'm hanging it up. Like, imagine what happens then, what the trickle effect would be if something like that does happen. I wouldn't say
I think it leans a lot more on Luka than anything else. Like, absolutely. if Luka's not signing his extension there, then a lot of the things are going to change. And that 27 pick is going to either be a lottery. It's likely going to be either a lottery pick or it's going to be back down into the 20s. So
for sure. Yeah, that's going to have that 27 for sure. I agree, Colin. It's going to, we're going to have to keep an eye on that one. That can end up being really valuable for sure. But the Mavericks weren't done today, guys. They made the move for PJ Washington, but they made another move. This is interesting to bolster their front line. And this kind of brings up a question that Avi and I discussed before we came on this pod here today. So the Wizards sent Daniel Gafford to Dallas in exchange for Rashawn Holmes and more draft compensation. So this brings more eyeballs to Dallas again for their front line because they just drafted Derek Lively, and he's had a very productive season for them. They've gained trust in him. He displayed an ability to be a plus defender, rim protector. He's a guy that displays a little bit of an ability to be a passer, a short roll passer. And, this is stuff that Avi and I talked about before. So, if you guys are looking for a deep dive on Derek Lively, check out that podcast where we went through some rooks and how I've been playing this season. But this kind of brings into question, how does Derek Lively fit with this team down the stretch? Gafford is under contract for multiple years. So this isn't a rental. This isn't a guy they're just going to try out for the season and just kind of let him go. This is a real investment here. He has multiple years left on his deal, and he is a starting level center. He's been starting for Washington for multiple years. So you bring him into the fold with Lively, and now it's like, okay, who's the 1, who's the 2 option? For now, it's probably going to be Gafford by default since Lively has been hurt. He's missing games. So Gafford slots in. He's a great 5. He can go get some lobs. There's a highlight I saw on Twitter from earlier today from a Washington game. I think it was last season where, he extended almost behind himself to grab a lob for a dunk. So, this isn't like a ground-bound center that can't go get lobs like Lively can. He can absolutely do that. He can get some boards. He can block shots occasionally. So he's a high-value center. But what happens when Lively is healthy? Do they go to Lively? Do they go to Gafford for the starting minutes? Who closes games? I mentioned this to Avi earlier as well. It might be matchup dependent. If they go against a Jokic, Embiid type player, a Giannis, a serious interior force, maybe one of those 2 guys gets the priority. But if it's more of a stretch big that doesn't put as much pressure on the hoop, like a Miles Turner, maybe someone else gets the nod that night. It just might depend on that. It might kind of flip between the matchups. So that's something I'm going to be keeping an eye on for the Mavericks, just in terms of the minutes distribution, because they're both very productive players, but it might just depend on the circumstance. And then for Washington, I would say that, this is a okay deal. Obviously, the draft compensation just matters more than anything. Yeah. So for them, I think it's kind of similar to what Charlotte did. their season's going nowhere. They didn't see a real value in keeping, these high quality rotation players. They'd rather just kind of start over. And, now Derek, or rather Marvin Bagley gets more of a runway to minutes along with Rashawn Holmes. And Bagley has displayed some flashes when there were some games before he got hurt to where he had some double doubles. He had some of that potential that the Pistons saw in him when they traded for him. And that's a whole nother conversation that we had in the past as to why they traded for him in the first place. But nonetheless, I do like kind of freeing up minutes for Marvin Bagley, see what you got in him. Maybe he gets back to being a double-double threat, and that really changes Washington's outlook as well. So that's kind of where I'm at with it. I want to see the draft compensation. I don't know if that's come out yet, but that's definitely going to affect things from their side of the equation.
Yeah, some details have come out about that. Again, over time, we'll get even more nuanced details about protections and whatnot. Well, actually, no, we do have that. We'll get more details of about how exactly the Actually, no, I think we might just have the details. We just need confirmation on whether or not these details are true or not, because based on what's already been reported, it seems like the Mavericks were able to acquire that first round pick from the Thunder in exchange for the Thunder now having the right to swap their 2028 first with the Mavericks 2028 first if they so choose. So that's a very valuable swap right. And of course, the Mavericks were then able to use that 2024 first, which, by the way, isn't even a very high first. It's likely to be somewhere between 26 or 27, if I had to guess, just based off of the standings and the teams. It's the second least favorable of a bunch of teams, two of which are really successful. So it'll probably be in that range. And in this class, that's not that valuable. So from Washington's perspective, there's not as much of a home run upside as there was for Charlotte in the PJ Washington deal. I think they just did this just to completely put more finishing touches on the rebuild. Like, they still have Kuzma because they still view him as maybe a central part of their future. But for someone like Gafford, who they're like, oh, he's a good player, but we don't view him as a central keystone to our future. Let's just trade him now and see what we can get. And they got a first out of it. So I suppose they're happy with that. But from the Mavericks perspective, these two deals in concert make this roster very interesting and then make their future very interesting, which is why I'm glad that we brought them up side by side. When you look at that roster now, they have like 5 or 6 players who you could qualify as either like small ball fives or power forwards or centers. And so it's going to be very interesting to see how they all shake out. Like Derek Jones Jr. To me is more of a power forward type. You have PJ Washington, you have Gafford, you have Kleba, you have Dwight Powell, and you have Lively. So we're already getting up there, and that doesn't even include someone like Markieff Morris or like Olivier Maxence Prosper, who are on the roster but probably won't play much for this team. But just in terms of leaning so heavily into 4s and 5s, they have a lot of those, but it makes me question a little bit more of the depth in the small forward and shooting guard positions and the wings. So we'll see about that. And then in terms of mortgaging their future, these two deals feel kind of risky. Now you're giving up a first for PJ Washington. You're potentially losing a high value first from 2028 to the Thunder, when the Thunder might still be good because, again, they are this successful despite being by weighted age the youngest team in the league. So their 2028 pick might still be good, whereas you might be out Luka, out Kyrie, and out that 2027 first. So you might be in a position where you're fully into a tank, and now they have the ability to exchange the swap rights. So this seems like the Mavericks are mortgaging everything they can to try to keep Luka and Kyrie happy now and for the next year or two, and then just like crossing their fingers and hoping they re-sign so they don't have to put up with whatever the future may hold for them.
Well, and I mean that's the thing that it's hard to say. Oh well, they might be in a complete rebuild, so they shouldn't be making these moves now. Well, if you don't make these moves now, you probably will be in a complete rebuild because Luka's going to leave, or you've just wasted these years with Luka, right? So
yeah, you can't do that.
You gotta make moves now with the assumption that you've done enough to prove yourself to Luka, and he's going to re-sign with you. You really can't bank on or assume the fact that Luka's going to be gone and you're going to be picking at the top of the draft.
Yeah,
I hope that you wouldn't be thinking that as an organization. I see where you're coming from, though, especially with that swap right with Oklahoma City.
And I guess the reason I went there was because the players you're trading them for aren't aren't proven commodities of being, I would say, starting level players on excellent teams.
Mhm.
So you really are taking a bit of a gamble here. Gafford and PJ Washington are young, so that is something in their favor where you're hoping that they can grow with Luka over time, and you're not worried about them sharply declining in 2-3 years. So that is a plus point. But the fact that these are maybe players who I would consider more like fringe starters, maybe bench players, and you're trading first for them, valuable first potentially,
Mhm.
that's where I start being a little bit more concerned. Because
Yeah.
it's not like I can say for sure with confidence that in 2 years these two players will be starters for the Mavericks. And so that makes it
Yeah.
very risky for
No,
me.
that's a good point.
sure.
And you know, when you think of these trades in a vacuum, is it market? And I think that it is. But when you think that when you look at the overall landscape of the Mavericks, does it get them to where they need to be this year or next year? Can they still be lined up to get the player that's going to put them into competing with the Nuggets, the Thunder, if they're there, if you think they're there, the Celtics, to actually win a title? Or are they just unloading first round picks now that they're not going to get back? And, you know, they're still at that, you know, only a top level team that's not necessarily a title contender. Where on the other side of things in the other conference, the Knicks are doing the exact opposite of that. They know that they haven't made that move yet to become the title contender, but they're not giving up any of their first round picks to get better, right? They
Right.
kept all of their first round picks somehow, but they got better at the deadline here. And so those are there. I feel like that both those teams are kind of in similar spots where they want to make one big swing for one more player, but they don't want to, but they also want to improve at the same time while they're waiting. And it's just hard to kind of balance the two. And it's not necessarily easy, but look, I mean, PJ Washington could come in, and I love what you're talking about with all these small ball fives. You can see it as a bad thing or a good thing. I think defensively it might be a problem, and who knows what Jason Kidd has up his sleeve, but it'll be really fun to see, you know, how it all comes together, and if it can come together and they can build a strategy around all these athletic players, and they can make it work. I mean, I think that would be really fun to see.
Oh yeah. No, Avi, I think you bring up a good point with the youth of these guys they acquired, because I think the difference between what the Mavericks had to do to acquire these players, what the Knicks had to do is,
Yeah.
you know, the Knicks are acquiring guys that are, you know, later on in their careers, you know, if anything, there's going to be a decline in their games instead of an incline. So I think that affects the market value of those players, what you're going to have to give up seconds as opposed to first. If you go out there and get guys that are just coming off the rookie contracts, it's a different equation. You know, if they're 24, 23 years old, it's like, okay, we're getting high quality players that could still get better. And it works the same way in the draft. If guys have more upside, it's going to command a higher pick as opposed to guys that have a lower ceiling or, you know, are already tapped out. They're going to be, you know, they're going to drift lower in that hierarchy. So that's the kind of key difference I noticed with that. But I guess overall I am in favor of this deal for the Mavericks. There's absolutely some risk there. It can backfire depending on how the next 2 or 3 years go. But, you know, like you said, Colin, you have to shoot for it. You have to give it a shot. Luka is probably one of the best players of our generation. And, you know, you owe it to him and to your franchise to put as much help around him as possible. But the questions will remain about that wing rotation. I think we keep coming back to that. You know, how does it work out on the, you know, the 2 and the 3, you know, behind those other guys that have in their rotation, especially in the playoffs? That's going to be a question mark. Can Derek Jones hold up in a deep playoff rotation? Can Tim Hardaway Jr. hold up in that kind of environment? So it's going to come back to that. And I think that's going to be the really big question mark. And that's going to be the make or break for them. The other positions are solid, very, very good. But in the middle, there's a lot of great wings out there. You might run into Kawhi, PG, Michael Porter Jr. What's the answer there? So we're going to have to keep an eye on and see how that goes. But for the next trade here, guys, that went down here today, another maybe a little bit lower profile, but still a significant contributor here. We're headed over to the Eastern Conference, and we're looking at Buddy Hield making a move here today. So Buddy Hield is low-key one of the best shooters over the past 7 or 8 years, on par with a Klay Thompson type, honestly, almost even a Curry type in terms of the volume of shots he takes, the amount of makes he has over the period of time. So for the Sixers acquiring Buddy Hield, it's significant, I believe. When you have a guy like Tyrese Maxey that can put so much pressure on defense going downhill, he himself can get super hot from the outside, step back jumpers, making the defense pay for sacking off even just a little bit. That kind of dynamic I'm interested to see kind of shake out. And then for the Pacers perspective, they get back some throw-ins. They get back Marcus Morris. They get Kork Maz. He wanted to trade for probably the last year or so. He gets his wish. Hats off to Kork Maz. He finally gets out of that situation. 3 second-round picks is the key here for looking at it from the Pacers perspective. So they gave up some picks to get Siakam. You get some of that back. That definitely helps their overall cup board as far as the draft capital goes. But losing Buddy Hield, I think for them, they just kind of saw a divide in regards to what Hield was going to command if they were going to re-sign him, and then how he fit into their current rotation. He had kind of fallen out. He had lost his starting spot. He kind of shuffled in between being as a starter and a reserve. And I guess the relationship just kind of broke down from there. They just didn't really see a future with him on that team. So they figured it was better to recoup some picks for him to just make more sense in the long term, kind of starting from next season and beyond. Still a very high profile player here in terms of the 3-point shooting. But, if there's a significant chance you don't retain him in free agency, it's better to move off of him and get something in return. It's kind of the age-old question. If you're not going to re-sign a guy, don't lose him for nothing. Just make that move if you can. So that's what the Pacers did. It looks like a pretty solid return here. 3 second-round picks is pretty good, for a guy like that. So I do like that move for them. And then, the Sixers just going full into that championship hunt. If Embiid can get his stuff right, get back into that rotation alongside Maxey, you have the shooting of Hield. That's a deadly combo from an offensive perspective. Looking at all three of those guys able to shoot, Tyrese can get downhill. Embiid is a monster in the paint. And then, Hield can launch. He had a game last season, I think it was, where he had a 3 in 10 seconds, the first 10 seconds of the game. Like, you can't leave him for a second. So I do like this return from both sides. There is some we're going to have to see what the Sixers do here if they want to re-sign Buddy Hield. But, I mean, their books are pretty nice. And, Colin, I'm sure you can expand on this. But looking at their books as opposed to when they had James Harden, it's a much better situation for them. And I believe they will have some space on their books to make a deal happen to re-sign him or go after somebody else if the rental doesn't work out. So
Can we just talk about their books first? Because it is, yes. I've never seen anything like this before. They have, because they traded Springer to the Celtics too.
Yep.
Right.
They have one guaranteed contract next year.
Wow.
One.
Exactly.
Wow. And of course it's Joel Embiid. They have Paul Reed on a non-guaranteed contract. And then they have Maxey, who's a restricted free agent. Yep. Everyone else is an unrestricted free agent.
That's
everyone
incredible.
Else. I've never seen that before for a not. I'm sure it's happened, but I don't remember it. But for bad teams, good teams, this is a playoff team, and Embiid's hurt now, so they're in trouble right now. But man, they were a top 2-3 team where they're in a situation where they literally have one guaranteed contract going into next year. I mean, Daryl Morey, man, he's an interesting guy. And it'll be Avi, I want to hear your take on Hield going there. I think it's a solid fit for them, especially when Embiid gets back. But yeah, I mean, he fits into exactly what Morey wants, which is an expiring contract who can contribute this year. And then they'll go from there. So, Avi, I want to hear your take on the fit, and then we can dive a little bit more into everything else.
I mean, before I even get into the fit, as you're mentioning, I'm thinking about it too. At least in modern cap history, I can't remember a single time when a player as good as Embiid is the only one who is projected to be on the roster guaranteed for the following season, with a chance being that the rest of his team could be completely different.
Right.
Now, in reality, that probably won't end up happening.
No.
They'll probably sign Maxey, but the fact still that there's just so many endless possibilities. They're not tied down on anyone other than Joel Embiid, I think is actually really impressive. And I'm kind of curious to see where Morey takes this. As for Hield, I understand why this happened with the Pacers. I understand that the relationship kind of broke down. The fact that even coming into the season, even at the start of the summer, there were talks that they wanted to give Mathurin the starting spot over Buddy Hield. So I'm sure the relationship was kind of fried from that point forward. But I mean, he's just such an effective player, and he's such a skilled shooter. I mean, him with Embiid, I can only imagine what Nick Nurse has cooking up. I have a feeling there will be a lot of those get actions that they love to do with Maxey, but only you're running more of those sets where Hield is the one coming off of pin downs, similar to some of the actions that they used to have JJ Redick run back in the day, which Embiid has plenty of experience with. So I just think it's a great fit. Defensively, there will be times that, sure, Maxey and Hield as a backcourt can get hunted, but that's where you can kind of stagger it. You have Melton there for support. So I think there are ways that you can manage having Hield and Maxey at the same time and still create a potent offense and uplift your team to be a championship caliber team. But it all comes down to Embiid, man. And if Embiid's hurt, then if he's not ready to go, if he is not Joel Embiid, best player in the series, things will get rough.
It's over. That's what we've seen in years past. I mean, he breaks down at some point. He's not 100%. And at that point, especially with this iteration of the team, it's bad luck, and they're not going to go very far if he's not himself. So that's the big question mark. But I mean, like we talked about before, if it doesn't work out, you just re-sign Maxey. You know, you can let Beal walk if you want. You have a clean slate. That's the beauty of this. They're not going up against the second apron or something like that to where they're going to get penalized like crazy. You know, they can just kind of not completely start over, but they can really retool this team around their two best players at the 1 and the 5. I think that's where it kind of all kind of works out. But I mean, are you guys in favor of this return? Like Indiana, I feel like they kind of had to move off of them, but I mean, getting 3 seconds back, I do like that return. Obviously, the placement of years is going to matter a lot here, but for a guy like that, I think it's fair. Would have been nice to see maybe a first. But he was expiring, so that might have brought down the value just a little bit. But I mean, I do like that return for them. But how do you guys feel about that side of things?
I believe Keith Pompey, if I'm seeing this correctly, reported that the 3 second rounders involved are a Raptors 2024 second, a Clippers 2029, and a Trailblazers 2029. So I mean, the 2024 pick doesn't do much for me, but the 2029 Clippers pick and the 2029 Trailblazers pick, depending on where the Blazers end up going from here, we're still not sure what exactly they'll be in 6 years' time. I think those 2 picks are interesting, but even best case scenario, they're what? Maybe they'd be high 30s, low 40s. Like, it's hard to say so far out how good those picks would be, but at least you give yourself some sort of upside with them. From the Pacers' perspective, I mean, I guess their trade deadline as a whole, it didn't feel particularly inspired, which feels very weird coming from the team that also made a trade for Siakam. Like, this seems like a team that wanted to get Siakam so that they could boost their future while also not coming into the present, despite having Siakam, who's a little bit older than Halliburton. So, like, it's not like they have aligned timelines anyways. It just feels like a very weird deadline.
I think that the return was okay. It's a little strange to have a team that you would think is in play and thinks that they're in play for like a playoff run here. Do they think that they're going to win the title? I don't know, but you think that you're going to win a series or two in the playoffs, and you get rid of a guy who, he's on the last year of his deal, but he averages more than 25 minutes a game for you. And like you said, he's an effective scorer. But the one thing that I'm surprised about is that they didn't get a player in return for him that, complements something either in the future or this year in a different way, because look, they have scorers all over the place. The Pacers can score. So if they got another effective defender, because that's what they needed, then that would have made a little bit more sense to me. But to trade him because it's expiring and they don't expect to re-sign him, that's a little bit surprising to me for a team that's in the middle of the playoff hunt here. But they turn around, they get McDermott back, so they get another shooter. So I mean, maybe they just thought, look, the delta between McDermott and Buddy Hield, it's not that far off. We can fill in the gaps there with our scoring, and we get 3 seconds for Hield here, so we'll do that and move on. I mean, that's the only thing that I can think.
I mean, I myself think there's a decent difference between McDermott and Hield, and I think
I do too. I'm just saying what they might be thinking.
Yeah.
No, I know what you're saying.
He was speaking from their perspective because I think we would all be in agreement that we don't feel that way, mostly because we don't feel like Doug McDermott can, stay on the court, not in terms of injury, just in terms of actually like keeping up with other players defensively, whereas Hield can. So
guys, to round out our trade deadline madness episode, we're going to get into one more trade here that went down. This is one of the first ones we saw today. Pretty interesting for both sides. It's going to be the Jazz and Raptors trade that they made. So the Jazz are here. They're sending Kelly Olynyk and Agbaji over to Toronto in this deal. I'll start there. I didn't see them doing this deal. I didn't expect this. They've had a strong run going from probably game 30 up until this point. Been playing very solid basketball. They're in the thick of the play-in hunt. And you would think that at least Agbaji would have a future on this team. He's had some solid moments for them, especially on the defensive end of the floor. So was surprised to see that. The Olynyk trade itself, I'm not surprised to see him moved out. He didn't fit their timeline, and there are other teams that can use his services. I wouldn't have thought that the Raptors would be seeking his services because they're on a similar timeline now that they've shipped out Siakam and shipped out OG Anunoby. So that was curious to see. And then you look at it from what they're getting back here. So Kyra Lewis comes back in this deal. They get Otto Porter, and then they get a 2024 first-round pick. So they did get a first out of this, which I'm sure Danny Ainge is thrilled about, just adding to that awesome arsenal of picks that's been building up over the last 2 years or so. Kyra Lewis is an interesting prospect. He does have a lot of unknowns still. He missed a whole year with an ACL injury. So I'm excited to see how he kind of fits into this team. He's probably going to be their third guard in that rotation. He's going to play behind Keontae George, I would imagine. So not sure if he's going to get a ton of minutes, but I'm sure they'll give him some run just to see what they have in him. Otto Porter's a throw-in. He can have some moments, but I mean, he's often hurt, and he's much older than that entire core. So he's just kind of whatever. But the first-round pick is definitely the hole for them. That's going to stand out here. And the first round pick will be the least favorable of OKC, the Clippers, the Rockets, and the Jazz in 2024. So automatically that pick doesn't have a lot of value, especially in this draft. The least favorable of all those teams is going to be either OKC or the Clippers. So that automatically puts it at the very back end of the draft. So that's a tough one, or at least the first round, I should say, the back end of the first round. So that's a decent return, I would say. But I guess from the Jazz, I just didn't expect them to make a trade like this right now with those two players, considering the kind of run they've been on. And then for the Raptors, I mean, Colin, we've had discussions in our chat with Neil, who is in the Toronto area, and we're continuously confused by what the Raptors are trying to do with these trades. It doesn't look like they've decided to completely tear it down. And this goes back to last year. They made that trade to get Pirtle from the Spurs. So it's just kind of like, it's almost like they're just fighting against themselves. It's like, what are you trying to do here? Do you want to just go all in towards just being terrible? Do you want to stay somewhat competitive? I just don't understand sometimes between the different moves they make. They seem to contradict themselves sometimes. So that's where I'm at. I didn't see this trade happening from either side. I'm kind of surprised. I don't love the return from the Jazz's perspective. The Raptors just seem like they don't have a direction. I guess my overall thoughts are I'm just kind of confused and surprised by this deal.
The Raptors have somehow managed to do something remarkable. If there were two different directions where one is a rebuild and the other is building yourself into like a strong playoff contender, in both directions, you can make a case that over the last year, they take one step back, one step forward and two steps back with every move they do, but somehow in both directions. if you're going towards a rebuild, they'll do a move that takes you one step forward and then it takes them 2 steps back. And then the next move will take them 2 steps back from being a playoff contender. So they're just like flipping back and forth like a Newton's cradle, right in the middle of just complete mediocrity. I don't want to say it's directionless because I think their idea was this 2024 pick might not be that valuable. We like Ochai Agbaji. We think we view him as a part of our future. We liked him when he came out. He's a high character player. That's some of the reporting that came out, how they were describing him. Olynyk can help us right now. He'll give more spacing to Scotty Barnes so that him and RJ can thrive a little bit better. He's also more of a natural passer than Quickly or RJ Barrett are. So, you can use that. I see it from that perspective. But in terms of the overall scope of what are you and what do you want to be, it's really difficult to pinpoint what exactly their goal is. Because even if the 2024 draft first round pick isn't that valuable, it will be towards the back half of a weaker class. There is still a little bit of a, it's almost like a lottery. I mean, excuse the pun, it's not in the top 14, but it is a lottery in itself. You don't know what player you could get from that. You don't know who you may scout from that. A couple years ago, they did something similar when they made the trade for Thad Young. They gave up a pick that I believe ended up being right around 20 for a pick that ended up being in the mid-30s where they ended up taking Christian Koloko. But in that 15-pick span, there were a bunch of players who maybe if they had been able to keep their pick and hadn't gone all in for Thad Young, maybe there were some better prospects they could have picked there. So it's just, I'm not quite sure what they're committed to.
Yeah, I was just as confused, and now just kind of I've been confused with Toronto. Last year I specifically remember talking on the podcast about the Jakob Poeltl trade and being a little confused about it, but thinking, look, they got another solid player. They gave up a first round pick, but now they can see where they're at with all of their players. They all have reasonable contracts. And then what they can do is start unloading these players if they aren't good enough. And that's essentially what they did. But then they keep bringing in other players and trading first round picks. But now that I'm looking at this, when you look at it in a vacuum and say they're giving up a first round pick, it does seem strange in bringing in Kelly Olynyk. But, if they do think that Ochai is better than, they grade him better than a 26 to 30 pick in this year, is it that bad of a trade? And Kelly Olynyk is expiring. So it's not horrible for that. It's not as confusing as I initially thought when you just read the tweet. You know what I mean? If they're high on him and they bring in another young player that they like, he's under contract for another 2 years. They can see what they have in him. And again, they grade him better than that first round pick. Then they think that they've scored with that, right? And if they had to absorb Kelly Olynyk to do it, who's expiring, then whatever. I mean, what does that matter? Now they say, I think there are reports that they plan on re-signing Olynyk. Whether that's true or not, who cares? We'll see if that's true. And if they need a veteran presence, if they need a stretch big, fine, to fit into whatever they're trying to do. On the other side of things, with what they're trying to do in the future, it is a little strange, but look, they got Quickly. They finally got something for one of their good players that they've had, right? So they got Quickly, they got Barrett. Quickly's looking great. And next year they're in good shape. They only have $80 million in guaranteed salary, and then they're probably going to exercise the Bruce Brown contract, which is another $23 million. But then they can trade him in the offseason if they look to do so. They'll probably get another first-round pick for him. Right. So, and then they'll get another first round pick back. They'll have plenty of cap space. And then, they'll have to extend Scotty Barnes starting when it kicks in the 25 season. So they're not in horrible shape. I do understand where it's like, where are they going? Why aren't they just completely, gathering as many assets as possible and unloading their team? But it's not as confusing as I initially thought beforehand, but we'll see where they go in the offseason now. I've given them time with the Poeltl trade, and now after this one, I'm like, okay, let's see what the offseason brings, because they still have good young talent. They still have Scotty Barnes. We'll see what happens in the offseason now.
Right. And two things came to mind while you made that uh, argument for them, Colin, or just really just kind of describe the scenario. The first of which being the fact that, this 24 was moved, and we've seen that as a theme this whole trade deadline. 24s have been moved multiple times. So what it shows me is that a lot of these teams that hold 24s don't see a lot of value. So they figure, move it. We can get somebody that we think, like you said, Colin, is just as good or better than that slot we would have if we kept the pick. So that's been interesting to me to see that these teams have really just kind of disregarded that pick. As in other years, we wouldn't see that. I don't have the numbers in front of me for last year, but I feel like, for 23, it wasn't quite the same story. I could be wrong, but this draft specifically, it has brought about more teams that are willing to do this and just kind of essentially punt and just roll that down the road a little bit in 25, where it's expected to be a better draft. And then, the second point about all this that I just keep thinking about is really the fact that the Raptors don't have a pathway to a super high lottery slot unless they just have amazing luck. Because you have all these teams down at the bottom, the Spurs, the Hornets, all these teams that are just absolutely just losing at a crazy rate. The Wizards, the Pistons. So I mean, you think at best maybe they're sixth somewhere in the draft, something like that. They're not going to be most likely top 3 or top 5, just because those teams are so bad. And the Raptors are still a decent team. They have some problems, but they're going to compete most nights.
Well,
so,
and don't forget their first round pick is going to San Antonio if they land 7-30. So
yeah,
there's no point, unless you're really banking on really tanking, which they're not. They weren't planning on it. There's no point in tanking at that point, right? So, and they still have Indy's first this year too. So it's not like they're completely out of the first round either. They still have another pick in the 20s too, which might be another reason why it's okay to unload one of the 20s for Oshai at this point, right?
Exactly. So from that perspective, I mean, why not bring in somebody like Olynyk? That's, like you said, Colin, he's going to be a good fit with the other players they just brought in previous trade. Stay competitive. There is a non-tangible element of this that we kind of forget sometimes. If you are a team like the Raptors and you have a certain standard that you've established over the past several years, you just won a championship in 19. You don't just want to go from that all the way to an environment like the Pistons or the Hornets, where you're losing every game, losing by 20, losing by 30. There is something to be said about just being competitive, being a solid team, winning some games down the stretch. It helps the culture. It helps the locker room. It's going to help these young players grow faster, which is what you want when you bring in a Quickly or a RJ Barrett or something like that. So that's just another aspect of this I just haven't seen a lot of people talk about that I think is worth mentioning. You want to have a winning culture. And yes, you're not going to be in the playoffs, but there's something to be said about just being competitive and hanging around, just being a solid team and then kind of building on that in the following years.
Yeah, they're well coached, and I think that does help foster the competitive spirit. They do have a lot of players who, when you watch the Raptors play, they're probably going to play hard. I just feel like over time, if you just get stuck in that loop of mediocrity, eventually you will sink to the bottom. And who's going to be there when you're sinking? I mean, right now, if I look at the roster, the only 2 players who I can say for certain I think are I maybe not blue chip, both of them, but premium young players would be Scotty Barnes and Quickly. And then you look at what they've done over the past couple of years in terms of trading away Norman Powell for Gary Trent. That didn't really work out. Some of the draft picks they've made, again, like the Thad Young trade they made that ended up netting them Christian Coloco, that didn't work out. So slowly but surely, the base of a strong Raptors development system and a strong Raptors player talent pool, both have been depleted to the point where now I'm just looking at 2 players who I think might be good enough to stop you from ever really tanking. But you also aren't taking the opportunities to gain as many picks as possible so that you can just throw your hat in the ring and hopefully get 2 or 3 more excellent players out of it. So, I mean, Ochai is good, but what he is a little bit more. He's more of a known quantity. Whereas if you have the draft pick, there's a chance you could get a player better than Ochai. Yeah, maybe it'll end up being worse, but you're kind of looking at the upside outcomes there. And if you're with Ochai Agbaji, I mean, right now we're looking at a player who a ninth man on the Jazz, and he's not particularly effective. If we were doing like a redraft or something or looking back at his class, you wouldn't necessarily even put him within the top 15 of his class. He's a solid enough pro, but it's hard to look at his game and see what steps he can make to become like a key starter or like a foundational piece. So it's just, it's difficult to watch them pick these known quantities time after time and almost outsmart themselves in a way.
Well, my question is, would you trade a second round pick for him? Because you're talking about, only a few slots at that point, right? So because we're talking about a Clippers or OKC slot in the
maybe
first
like
round,
pick 40,
so.
maybe pick 40 onwards. I don't know if I would pick even pick 35, just because again, you never know who you might get.
Yeah.
Again, most of the time, pick 20 to 30, 40. Maybe most of the time, it's not going to give me Ochai Agbaji. But every one in maybe 3 or 4, if it hits, I might get someone much better, and that's someone who I can build around, rather than just someone who's on my roster who I'm trying to develop. But if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. But that's different from gathering one of those foundational pieces. So that's just kind of my view on it.
True. Yeah. I mean, from their perspective, I guess, it was just worth bringing him in. And I guess they might have a different opinion of him than we do. Maybe they still see a pathway to being even better than we believe. So if that's their philosophy, that's their mindset, it makes sense to just go ahead and make the swing. And only time will tell if that really plays out. So guys, I really had a fun time here just discussing these trades with you. We're going to wrap this up. But always a pleasure having you two on the podcast. Great conversations here, and conclude it's another great trade deadline. I wish we can talk about the other moves made here, but all in all, it was very eventful, and I can't wait to see how this all shakes down the stretch. But if you guys are looking for more content just like this, be sure to check out our website, notradeclause.com, our socials, No Trade Clause on Instagram, _clause on Twitter. More interviews coming up, more podcasts just like this. Hope you guys will stick around for the ride as we get into the stretch run of the season. Kind of hard to believe, but the playoffs are not that far away. So hope you guys enjoyed this installment. We hope to see you on the next podcast. And until then, enjoy this NBA season, and we'll catch you soon. See ya.